My name is Lavra, and at 38 years old, the rain slammed against the windows of my apartment in Seattle. The storm drummed a steady rhythm, like the world itself was reminding me of something older, something stubborn. I sat on the couch, my laptop still open, the proposal I had been working on refusing to make sense. My phone buzzed sharply once, cutting through the quiet. A new voice memo. I didn't hesitate. I tapped play, expecting maybe a note from a client, or a reminder I had recorded for myself. But instead, Ethan's voice filled the room. Mom, I've been thinking about what we talked about. Lavra just isn't reliable. She's unstable, careless. If we want to make sure the house and the accounts are safe, you need to transfer everything to me. I'll handle it. She doesn't have the judgment for this. Those words hit me like a punch to the chest. 27 seconds. That was all it took to shatter years of holding the family together silently. I sat frozen, staring at the dark glass of the window. My reflection pale and almost unrecognizable. Ethan hadn't meant for me to hear it. He thought he was whispering in a safe direction, shaping our mother's opinion of me again. But the memo was a proof of his plan, deliberate, sharp, and aimed at pushing me out of my own family story. The memo ended, leaving a silence heavier than the storm outside. I saved the file, placed the phone on the table, and leaned back. Tomorrow, I knew, I would not wake the same. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but inside, my chest felt heavier than any cloud above Puget Sound. My mind traveled back to our childhood in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Our early years were simple but rigid. Ethan was the boy everyone remembered, the star of the soccer team, charming, always praised by teachers, even when his homework was late. I was the girl who studied hard, the one in the library during lunch. People remembered Ethan's goals, not my academic awards. Mom loved us both, but pride in her voice always rose louder when she spoke about him. Ethan is such a natural leader, she would say at parent-teacher nights. About me, she would smile softly, saying, Lavra is dependable. It was never meant to sting, but it drew a quiet line between brilliance and background. That line followed us into adulthood. When bills from Mom's old house came due, I was the one on the phone, sorting out late fees, filing paperwork. Yet, at family dinners, Ethan would casually mention, Don't worry, I covered the taxes again this year, and Mom's eyes would shine. I stayed silent, swallowing the familiar knot in my stomach. Ethan had perfected the rhythm. Public praise to keep me in line. Private whispers to make me doubt myself. At dinners, he would lean close to Mom, murmuring just loud enough for me to hear, Lavra works too much. She forgets things. I worry about her stress. I would chew my food slowly, pretending it didn't matter. Pretending the words weren't carving away my space in the family. Now, with the memo still echoing in my ears, I realized those years had been rehearsals. The private criticisms I ignored, the humiliations I let slide, they had all built the foundation for this moment. Ethan had been writing the family script for decades, and I had played the role he assigned without question. Sitting in my Seattle apartment, with proofs saved to my phone, I knew the script was about to change. This time, I would not perform his lines. The older I got, the easier it was to confuse Ethan's words for truth. He would glance at my groceries when I stopped by Mom's house, shake his head, and mutter, Do you really need all this fresh produce? Half of it will spoil. When I explained it was for Mom's meals, he would sigh, pretending I was wasteful, not thoughtful. At first, I brushed off the comments, but soon they multiplied, slipping into every conversation about money, time, and care. Then the numbers spoke louder than his words. One night, reviewing Mom's bank statements, I noticed recurring withdrawals tied to a small business labeled Ethan's LLC. Small at first, $150. $200, but steady, like a quiet drain. Over 6 months, it totaled nearly $6,000. When I confronted him, he laughed softly, like he was amused I could be so confused. Lavra, you misread this. Those are reimbursements. You wouldn't understand. It's complicated, he said, tilting his head with that patronizing, polished charm. For a moment, I almost believed him. But my gut whispered otherwise. I couldn't show Mom not yet. I couldn't shatter her trust in her son. Silence was safer, but I knew silence made me complicit. I folded the statements into a folder, edges biting into my palm, as if to remind me that truth could hurt. But ignoring it would hurt more. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay on the couch until the sky began to gray, storm-spent, yet my inner storm just beginning. At 5:30 a.m., I rose, pulled on a sweater, and moved quietly through my apartment. The folder with bank statements waited in my desk. I added new pages, utility bills, invoices, anything that tied Mom's finances to Ethan's claimed reimbursements. I photographed every page, uploading them to an encrypted drive I had long used for work. This time, the stakes were higher than any client campaign. Later that morning, at Mom's house, I moved carefully through her study while she slept upstairs. Legal documents lined the cabinet. The deed to her Portsmouth property, insurance policies, pension statements. I spread them on the desk, photographed everything, then replaced the sheets exactly as I found them. It felt both protective and invasive, but neglect would have been worse. Back in Seattle, I reviewed my voicemail history, saving every message Ethan had left in the past year, the charming ones, the clipped, cold ones. Each file went into a folder labeled Simply Proof. The final step was physical. I drove to Portsmouth and rented a PO box 2 blocks from the church where Mom still sang in the choir. From that point on, any mail, bills, or correspondence would go through me first. No more lost statements. No more excuses. Standing in the parking lot, key in hand, I felt the morning air sharpen my lungs. Leaving at dawn hadn't been about escape. It was about mapping the battleground before Ethan even knew there was a fight. Driving back toward Seattle, the sun rose pale over the coast. I knew the 27 seconds of betrayal was already rewriting the hours that would follow. The folder grew heavier by the day, but evidence without direction is clutter. I needed someone who could turn it into something undeniable. The next step was finding someone who could make the evidence speak louder than my voice ever could. That led me to a small brick office in downtown Seattle, where an elder law attorney named Henry Callahan agreed to meet me on short notice. His office smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, the kind of place that made you feel that serious work happened here. I laid out the situation clearly. The voice memo, the withdrawals, the paper trail I had built. Henry listened without interrupting, nodding slowly, his expression serious but calm. When I slid the copies across the desk, his eyes hardened slightly, though his tone remained even. Lavra, you understand that anyone managing a parent's finances must act in their best interests, right? Any deviation, especially self-enrichment, can qualify as financial exploitation. Guardianship is usually only needed if a parent is incapable. But in this case, it's not about incapacity. It's about misplaced trust in the wrong person. I nodded, absorbing every word. Henry handed me a checklist, clear dates, matching bank statements, records of Ethan's signatures, and any testimony from people who had witnessed irregularities. It was a blueprint, precise, and necessary. That afternoon, I started making calls. Mom's visiting nurse, Clara, remembered Ethan insisting on paying cash for prescriptions that were already covered by insurance. She agreed to write a statement confirming the details. The church treasurer, a quiet woman named Miriam, recounted how she had questioned Ethan about large donations withdrawn from Mom's account, but he brushed her off. She was willing to document her observations. The last step was the bank itself. I visited Sound Savings, where a branch manager who had known our family for years pulled up the account histories, confirmed the automatic transfers to Ethan's LLC, and printed official records complete with stamps. I felt a surge of relief. For the first time, I had tangible proof that could not be dismissed. By evening, my dining table was a fortress of evidence, statements, receipts, notarized letters, and photographs. Each page a brick in the wall I was building. Ethan's charm and whispers had shaped the story for decades, but now I held something he could not manipulate. The weekend arrived, and I suggested a trip for just Mom and me under the pretense of a change of scenery. We rented a small cottage in Tacoma, overlooking the harbor, where the early spring air was sharp with salt. The first day, I let Mom enjoy herself. We cooked soup together, walked along the docks, and watched seagulls wheel over the fishing boats. I didn't mention Ethan didn't speak of betrayal. I waited until the second evening, when the fire had burned low and her hands rested quietly in her lap. "Mom," I said softly, my voice steady, "there's something you need to hear." I pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the quiet cottage, casual, confident, dismissive. Lavra just isn't reliable. She's unstable, careless. You need to transfer everything to me. She doesn't have the judgment for this. Silence fell heavier than the tide outside. Mom's eyes blinked, her lips tightening. He means well. You know how he exaggerates when he's worried, she said. I slid the binder across the table toward her. Bank statements, signed records, statements from the nurse, and the church treasurer. Each document carefully organized. Each page another argument in the language Ethan could not rewrite. This is not exaggeration, I said, my voice calm. This is what he's been doing. Mom turned the pages slowly, her fingers trembling. For each date I named, she looked into my eyes, searching for uncertainty, but I had none to offer. The weight of the document accomplished what my words alone never could. Mom's face softened, not toward me, but with sorrow. He's my son, she whispered, voice trembling. I can't just cut him off. I'm not asking you to disown him, I said gently. I'm asking you to see the truth. She closed the binder, resting her hand on it as if it were fragile glass. After a long pause, she met my eyes. I need time. It wasn't the victory I wanted, but it was a breach in the wall Ethan had built. For the first time, Mom had heard his words without the smile that usually disguised his intentions. The silence that followed felt like the beginning of a reckoning. The invitation came through Mom, not Ethan. That was telling enough. Ethan had arranged a brunch in Seattle, choosing a waterfront restaurant where half the family could gather under the pretense of celebration. I arrived early and Ethan was already there, arm draped casually over Mom's chair. His smile broad enough to convince anyone he had nothing to hide. The first 30 minutes were theater. He ordered from Mom, joked about my late nights and deadlines, and then slid into seriousness. I worry about Lavra, he said, glancing at Mom. She's been overworked, a little paranoid lately. She thinks there are problems with Mom's accounts, but it's just stress. Mom didn't contradict him. She sat with her coffee, nodding faintly, her eyes lowered. For a moment, the floor felt like it had shifted beneath me. His words were polished, practiced enough to erase the weekend in Tacoma, to make me doubt if the binder and the memo still mattered. But I was ready. I opened my bag and pulled out notarized letters from Sound Savings, each stamped with official seals. Next, I produced a sheet showing recorded timestamps of Ethan's withdrawals, matched to the dates he claimed to have paid Mom's bills. I laid them on the table quietly. Cousins leaned in. Aunt Patricia adjusted her glasses to read. Mom's face went pale, torn between the two realities. Ethan's polished voice rose, sharp and cracking. This is manipulation. Lavra has always been jealous. She doesn't understand real responsibility. His hand hit the table, rattling the cutlery, but no one rushed to soothe him. They simply stared, and for the first time, his polished mask slipped in front of the witnesses he had carefully invited. I gathered the letters back into my bag. My heartbeat was steady. For the first time, the room wasn't bending around Ethan's version of events. It was bending around the truth. The weight of silence no longer belonged to me. Within a week, the consequences were swift. Sound Savings froze the transfers tied to Ethan's LLC, citing irregular activity pending review. The withdrawals that had once slipped quietly now sat under scrutiny. Every number, every date, became a red flag. Henry moved quickly. He filed for emergency accounting, requesting a court order forcing Ethan to produce detailed records of how he had handled Mom's funds. He explained it was only the first step, but enough to make Ethan sweat. Meanwhile, the church treasurer called. The board had decided to suspend Ethan's proposed charity fund until they could verify the sources of the donations. Carefully worded, but clear in meaning. They no longer trusted him. Ethan didn't go silent. He called late at night, always after midnight, his voice low and tight with fury. You don't know what you've started, Lavra. You think you're helping her? You're ruining everything. I let him speak. Every threat, every slip of temper became a recording, another piece of proof. I didn't respond. Silence was stronger than any argument, and I could hear the frustration in his voice growing. A storm he could not control. By the third call, his tone had shifted from rage to pleading, but I kept recording. I kept my distance. Mom noticed the shift too, though she didn't speak about it openly. She lingered longer on the phone with me, asking careful questions, seeking reassurance. The doubt that had held her quiet at brunch was cracking, replaced by recognition. The folder grew heavier each day, filled with evidence. The numbers, the statements, the recorded calls, they were undeniable. Ethan could not twist the truth this time. I knew it. And for the first time, I felt a weight lifting, a path forming. The battle was far from over, but the ground had shifted. The following weeks were a careful, measured rhythm. Each day, I added new pieces of evidence to the folder, copies of canceled checks, emails, invoices, notes from Clara and Miriam. Every voicemail Ethan had left that contained even the smallest hint of manipulation. Each document, each recording, was another layer of protection for Mom, and a shield for myself. Mom, for her part, began to change subtly. She no longer asked me to handle everything quietly, nor did she dismiss my concerns as paranoia. The weekend in Tacoma had opened a door, and although she was hesitant at first, the documents made the reality undeniable. Her expression shifted from worry and guilt to cautious recognition. I could see the weight of decades of trust, placed in the wrong hands, slowly starting to lift. With Henry's guidance, we began preparing a formal petition to place Mom's assets into a living trust overseen by 2 independent attorneys. The goal was simple: prevent Ethan from accessing anything without oversight, while protecting Mom's financial independence and dignity. The living trust was precise, structured so that no single child could manipulate it, no loophole could be exploited. Every account, every property, and every document was accounted for. Ethan, of course, did not take the preparation lightly. He called late at night, his voice tight, strained with both fury and disbelief. "You don't understand what you're doing. Lavra, you're tearing the family apart," he hissed, trying to twist concern into accusation. I recorded every word, letting the tension spill through the phone, documenting the manipulation that had been his method for years. I said nothing. Silence was the most powerful response. Mom herself was cautious but resolute. When the day came to meet at the Brunswick law firm for the signing, she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression a mixture of sorrow and determination. She understood what was at stake. Henry explained every detail once more: the oversight mechanisms, the dual signatures required for transactions, the legal protections against exploitation. Mom nodded, steady but quiet. "I can't just hand over everything to Ethan anymore," she admitted softly. "I need someone I know will act in my best interest." I reached out and held her hand, feeling the trust transfer not in documents or legalese, but in that simple, unspoken moment. When the pens were lifted and signatures applied, the shift was palpable. Ethan's name was gone from any access to her accounts. Every asset, every bill, every account now required dual oversight. The trust wasn't just legal protection, it was a declaration that the family could no longer be manipulated through charm or intimidation. Of course, Ethan learned of the trust immediately. He arrived at Mom's house that afternoon, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. His face was red, his voice rising in a torrent of accusations. "This is ridiculous! You're turning her against me!" he shouted. He looked to aunts, cousins, anyone who might side with him, but no one moved. Their silence was different this time. It wasn't fear. It was refusal. For the first time, I didn't feel small in his presence. I stood in Mom's study, the brass key to the filing cabinet resting in my hand. Mom had pressed it into my palm earlier that day, and it carried a weight far heavier than any signature. It was trust, finally given without condition. It was the key to real oversight, to real protection. With the trust in place, life slowly began to recalibrate. Mom returned to her routines, cooking, gardening, and attending choir practice, but now without the shadow of manipulation hanging over every decision. Our conversations grew lighter. We spoke more about recipes, the garden, the songs she loved, and less about the tension with Ethan. She no longer asked me to carry her worries in silence. I, too, began to reclaim my own life. I signed the lease on a small apartment near Elliott Bay, its windows opening to the harbor where the tide moved freely, independent of anyone's control. For the first time, I felt the walls around me belonged solely to me. I kept the brass key on a hook near the door, not out of necessity, but as a reminder. A symbol of when trust and my own agency shifted into my hands. The aftermath of the trust placement was swift. Sound Savings continued their investigation, and every withdrawal tied to Ethan's LLC became a matter of scrutiny. The church board suspended his proposed charity fund until they could verify all contributions. For the first time, his actions had consequences beyond my voice. Public exposure, legal oversight, and social accountability began to constrict the manipulative web he had relied on for so long. Ethan didn't disappear. He called, late and low, his tone vacillating between anger and pleading. "Lavra, you're making a mistake. You're hurting Mom, and you'll regret this." I let him speak, recording every call. Each voicemail, each threat, each attempt to shift blame became part of the permanent record. I never responded. Silence, combined with evidence, became the tool that finally held him accountable. During this time, I also began taking steps outside the immediate family. With the help of Henry, Clara, and Miriam, I started a small community fund designed to help caregivers. It covered things like transportation for medical appointments, gaps in prescription coverage, and respite hours for those tending to aging parents. Donations were modest, but each one carried the promise that others would not feel cornered, helpless, or trapped in silence as I once had thought. It was more than charity. It was an extension of the hard-won agency I had fought for, a way to ensure that truth, transparency, and care could reach beyond the walls of my own family. Sometimes, walking along the harbor in the early morning, I thought back to the first dawn when I had copied documents in the dark, my hands trembling with both fear and determination. I knew now that it wasn't escape I had been seeking, but a line drawn, a boundary that could not be erased. Each step since then, each legal filing, each phone call, each careful recording, formed a path that no one else could claim. Ethan continued to push, but the walls around him had shifted. He could no longer manipulate the story. Every word he spoke was weighed against undeniable proof. He tried charm, guilt, and intimidation, but all of it was countered by documentation, witnesses, and legal structures. His control had slipped, and for the first time he could not undo the truth. Mom, freed from the weight of secret worries, began to relax. She cooked without fear, handled her correspondence with clear oversight, and even laughed again without reservation. Our relationship, once strained by decades of unspoken competition and hidden whispers, started to heal. Trust was fragile, but for the first time it rested on reality, not manipulation. And me? I had reclaimed more than oversight. I had reclaimed the authority to act without fear of reprisal, the knowledge that preparation and persistence could counter years of manipulation. The brass key on my hook was no longer just a symbol. It was a promise to myself that I would no longer be silenced, ignored, or undermined. The fight had been long, meticulous, and exhausting. But it had also proven that truth, supported by evidence and law, could finally tip the scales in favor of fairness. Each day, as I walked along Elliott Bay, the tide moving freely, I felt a connection to that morning when I first copied documents in the dark. The struggle had not been an escape, but a reclamation of trust, of agency, and of life itself. Months passed, and the rhythm of life began to settle into something quieter, more controlled, and fully mine. The living trust had created clear boundaries. Mom's assets were safe, and Ethan could no longer access accounts or make unilateral decisions. The relief wasn't immediate, it was subtle. A quiet easing in my chest that grew day by day. Mom had returned fully to her routines. She baked, tended the garden, attended choir practice, and even started a small book club with friends from church. Each of these routines carried a new sense of freedom. She no longer asked me to shoulder her worries in silence, nor did she apologize for past mistakes or indecision. The weight of misplaced trust had been lifted, and for the first time, she moved confidently in her own life. Ethan, predictably, continued to push. He called occasionally, his tone alternating between feigned concern and barely contained fury. "Mom doesn't understand what you're doing, Lavra. You're ruining everything." Each call was recorded, of course, and added to my ever-growing archive of proof. But the calls became less threatening over time. as it became clear he no longer had influence. He had lost the one tool he relied on most, secrecy. The community began to respond as well. With the support of Clara, Miriam, and Henry, I formalized the caregiver fund I had started during the early months of the crisis. Modest contributions trickled in at first, but word spread. Caregivers, exhausted and often overlooked, reached out for support with transportation costs, prescription coverage, and respite hours. Every small donation carried the promise that someone else would not have to endure the confusion and helplessness I had faced. The fund became more than a charitable gesture. It became a lifeline for many. Volunteers stepped forward to help with deliveries, appointment coordination, and community education. Local businesses offered small donations or services in kind. Slowly, the project grew, a direct response to the pain and struggle Ethan's manipulation had caused in our own family. In helping others, I found a measure of peace and purpose that had eluded me for decades. Ethan's influence in the family crumbled in a way I had not anticipated. The brunch confrontation, followed by the legal restrictions imposed by the trust, had exposed him to family scrutiny he could no longer avoid. Cousins who had once hesitated to take sides now spoke openly about discrepancies they had noticed, about times they had felt uncomfortable with his behavior. The church board no longer accepted his explanations without documentation, and local community members began to question his integrity in other matters. I know now that it was never an escape. It was a map, a line drawn, a path claimed, a plan written in ink so it could never again be erased. Every step since has connected to the next, forming a route no one else could take from me. I didn't leave to run away. I left to take control, to protect what mattered, and to ensure that truth, transparency, and trust would no longer be optional. The tide continues to rise and fall, unstoppable and free. And so does my life, anchored, measured, and finally my own.